right, good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thank you to ADI for the opportunity to get together with everybody. Haven't done one of these webinars in quite a while. I forget how much it is like talking to the abyss. So please ask any and all questions in the Q&A, and I'll try and stay on top of that as we move along, and then try and save some time at the end as well if anybody has any further questions when we get to that point. I'm going to attempt to share my screen to the presentation. The topic today is fine-tuning your tasting room experience. So it looks at a lot of different aspects, and how I like to describe it before I flip it over is looking at it kind of from the 35,000 foot view, and then just kind of narrowing the funnel. And at the end, we'll talk about specific things like retail, tasting rooms and tours specifically. And then I have, if time permits, some in there about on-site events, some considerations for on-site events, and also VIP experiences, which I think are something that maybe many of you have thought about, but if you haven't, something that I would definitely put on your radar. So, all right. Okay. So hopefully everybody now is seeing the slide deck. If you're not, please let me know in the comments section, and we will make that change. All right. So fine-tuning your tasting room experience. So like I said, the first way that I like to think about it is thinking about your distillery as an attraction. I tend to default to attraction from a tourism perspective, but you can equally think about it from the perspective of somebody that might frequent your establishment who's not necessarily from out of town, right? I think that both apply, whether we're thinking about things to do while we're on vacation, or we're thinking about things to do on a night when we have a chance to explore the destination that we live in. The thought process oftentimes is very similar. I'm not going to dig too deep into this abyss, but the idea is, and if you want to dig deeper, a couple of places to start would be experiential marketing and customer experience tourism. The idea that taking it beyond just advertising messages and the more traditional marketing, whether it be print or audio or visual in different ways, and thinking about it more from how can we set the hook as deeply as possible when people come and visit. Again, whether that's just a one-off experience or whether that's every month or every time they have a chance to get out. Just to run real quickly, kind of lessons in terms of how we can tie brand and brand affinity ultimately to that experience. Experiential marketing tells us customization is key. And this is something that I'm going to touch on a couple of times as we go. But customization in that everybody has a different expectation about what they want out of the experience. And if there are ways within your distillery tasting room that you can allow people to cater that, is it just a quick stop to pick up the bottle? Is it they want a keepsake from their trip because they visited a couple days ago, or do they want the full experience, sit down, maybe if there's a tour or something of that nature going on? So customization is key, and really you allowing them to customize it on the fly on their own terms. Community involvement and orientation. So you don't have to have an opinion on every cause, but it is good to have a couple of things that are external to your business that you're passionate about and that you're really forward and directed, that your business supports in some way or another, right? This could be, again, human-based experience. It could also be things in the environment that you're interested in, right? Every community is a little bit different, and every person has something that they value that may be part and parcel to your business in some way, but should be kind of external to daily operations. If not for anything, of course, that's a good moral and ethical practice to be involved in the network that you operate in locally. But people like to kind of see and feel and kind of understand that connection, if you will. Interactive interpretation, if there are, and this is something else we'll touch on later, so I won't spend too much time. If there are ways within a typical experience at your distillery to make it interactive anyway, take that opportunity, right? And I've written some in the past about using the five senses model. How are ways within a typical experience can we engage the five senses? Some are easier than others, but it's just a tool to think about in terms of how we can increase that interaction in terms of what we're trying to convey in interpretation. And then I talked over a little bit this last one, but social and environmental awareness. The idea of you exist within, at minimum, a business ecosystem, a social ecosystem, and an environmental one, and just being kind of aware of where you fit, right? Again, not needing to necessarily take a stance or anything, but just having an answer when those questions come up. On the other side, customer experience tourism is really this idea of, as distillers, I think most of us are in the business of it's a production business, right? We make a product, a physical, tangible product, and the business hinges on selling enough of that product, right? But there's a brand built around that, and the idea between customer experience tourism is this idea that kind of interaction with the brand is enough to be an attraction in and of itself, right? And there are classic examples of the Coca-Cola plant, or every time I go to Colorado to visit my brother, it's you got to go to the brewery in Golden, right? Just because it's enough of an attraction in and of itself. What that really then leads to is the ability to tell your brand story in a really deep way, right? Physical plant and production process. So again, spirits are magical, right? You're taking raw ingredients and you're putting it into a bottle, and it does magical things to us. And so people want and are still interested. It's definitely a subset, if not everybody has a keen interest in what does that look like, right? If not the still, how do you then get it into a bottle, or what does the shipping look like, or whatever it might be? So getting eyeballs on that in any way you can, even the mundane parts of what you think you do, can be really key to that experience. Obviously, brand is tied to history and the culture. Remember, this is where you can further kind of embed yourself in what's going on around you. And maybe it's really hyper local, maybe it's a state level thing, and maybe it's broader and you're telling a bigger story there. And then, of course, and I think this is the yeah, duh part of it, but the idea that a customer experience should have some fundamental element of visceral tasting, right? And this is something that most of us should do, if not all of us, at some point in the experience. And so really what we're trying to do through all these series of different points is we're trying to build towards brand affinity, which comes from positive recall, right? And we'll talk about in hospitality how we don't necessarily always have full control over their experience, right? We can only do what we can do to make it a positive one, and then be aware of the things that might come into play that would detract from that experience. And then ultimately, right, we want to create brand ambassadors, right? Every time they come through town, they stop and get a bottle, and therefore they're spreading the word. Or they come once and have such a good time, they're going to buy that t-shirt or that sticker and throw it where it's going to be seen all the time. And what I like, I don't know if this is a coinable term, the idea of kind of memorable knowledge, right? So things that we remember, we know, right? And so if we have such a good experience that makes it memorable, we're going to keep that knowledge about how you make your whiskey or what you put in your gin. That creates a very knowledgeable brand ambassador. And we know, or we should have a knowledge or an understanding of how powerful word of mouth marketing can be. All right, moving on. So what is a distillery experience? It's hard, right, to talk in specifics. I've been to enough distilleries at this point. Obviously, everyone is unique, but when you start to pull apart, it's even more unique. And so I'll talk in generalities, and what I guess I would ask is for the value in it, think about it in terms of the context of your distillery. And while that sinks in, I see that there is one question in the Q&A here, and I'll go ahead and tackle it before we move on. How do you scale customization? Very difficult, and I understand that. I think that we have to think about customization from a it's not going to be necessarily the exact experience a person wants, i.e. fully customized, but instead think about it from the perspective of creating choice within their experience, right? So maybe there are only 3 different experiences you can kind of model and create. It doesn't mean that somebody has to pick one of the 3 necessarily, but instead we think of it more like a menu that they can pick and choose, right? So it could be, let's just imagine a distillery, small kind of self-guided tour operation, a small tasting room with retail, and that's about it, right? That's just kind of the basic setup. Maybe somebody who's further along in the brand affinity spectrum wants to come and spend some time there and learn a little bit deeper than what the typical self-guided tour does, providing that option in some way. And maybe it's not regularly, maybe it is, right? Also, if somebody wants to just come and have a cocktail, happy hour style on their way home from work, allowing them to do that without being interrupted by the other things that are going on. And then third would be, full access. And this is just kind of one of those key things to the retail part of the operation, right? Either the cellar door bottle sales or anything else that you might build around that. We want that to be, of course, the most accessible and easiest part of the whole experience. So someone could come and do all of those things and customize it in that way, or somebody could pick and choose one of the 3 or 2 of the 3 or whatever. And so in that way, it kind of inherently becomes scalable. And it's hard outside of then digging further into the context of a specific distillery, what you might be able to do to add points of customization and then scale that up as well. Hopefully that answered. And a discussion could follow on that alone. But moving on. So distillery experience, one of the lessons that I learned early on was that impressions start in the parking lot, right? And bathrooms matter. What I think the idea there is again, this is not rocket science, but the idea that whether you're in an industrial park or you've cleared land and built from the ground up, the experience in the approach to the distillery in this case is critical, because that's when the impressions are starting to be formed, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be polished, right? So some of the best distilleries that I visited are in seemingly obscure places, way in the back of industrial parks and this kind of thing. But I think more that we just have to think about what that approach looks like and feels like, and how we can then coordinate once they get in our doors with that sense that they might kind of already have. The second bullet there, I've already kind of alluded to, this idea of that in the hospitality game, we can do everything perfectly in servicing that experience, and that there's still things that are going to be outside of our control. First and foremost, service is subjective, right? I teach at a college where about 50% of our students are in-state, 50% are out of state. They often have very different perspectives on what quote unquote good customer service sounds like or feels like, because they're from different parts of the country. I use that example just to denote the idea that a heavy-handed approach is appealing to some, a hands-off approach is appealing to others. It's more of kind of what fits with the culture of your brand and what is successful, and having a lack of a fear to change it kind of on the fly. And then second part of that, of course, is that there's a lot of variables that exist outside of our sphere of influence, right? We can have the best juice in the bottle, right? And many of us craft some stuff that is out of this world good. But if it's raining that day, if I was in traffic in the 15 minutes it took me to get here, et cetera, because when we talk about tasting rooms and people coming to the distillery, what we're really selling is that experience. And hopefully the outcome is a bottle purchase or purchase of something else, but the experience is what we're selling, and that's what they're going to base it on, right? Not just the juice in the bottle. And I think it's just something to think about, right? Don't beat yourself up for one, but think about it as well. If it is raining, are there ways that we might be able to accommodate that to kind of ease that pain? Okay. The middle one there, patrons vary from spirit enthusiasts to first timers. And what I tell people is err towards servicing the first timers, right? Because the fact that is the spirit enthusiasts, the selling part of it has already been done, right? They've already made the choice to come, which means they have a propensity to purchase in some way. If you can then turn your attention and focus on creating a good experience for somebody that's maybe doesn't necessarily have as much of an affinity for spirits or your brand or whatever it might be, that's where the gold is, right? Because then the pendulum can fully swing. They'll have a great experience, and then the outcome that we want in terms of a purchase is much, much more likely. And so that's just something to think about. And again, that looks different depending on where you're at and what your typical kind of customer is at your distillery. Of course, I can't talk anymore without saying rules are different and ever changing, right? When I first started thinking about this stuff some years ago, cocktail bars at distilleries was something that we were all, or a lot of us were hopeful for, and that seems to dominoes are starting to fall there fully. Of course, DTC is something that we're all grappling with right now. So understand that when it comes to visitation in particular, just like on the production side, rules are ever changing. And it's to say that, well, I guess some of the stuff I say might not be completely applicable to everyone, and it might not be applicable in 6 months. The other part of it is more of just like make sure that you're staying apprised of this stuff so you don't run afoul of any of that. And we know how detrimental that can be. And then context is important to consider. And again, I've alluded to some of this, but what does it take to visit, right? Are you a pedestrian thing? People are going to be walking by and stopping in, or is it out of the way in the sense that people are going to have to get there and find their way there? That again makes a big difference into the overall experience, which is what we want to think about. And then what is proximal to the distillery, right? Unless you're serving food, for instance, what is that, and what does that look like, and how is it going to affect timing and that sort of thing? And we'll talk more about that as we go along. All right. Seeing no more questions, I will just continue to move on. So tasting rooms and tours. The way that I like to think about it is, well, first and foremost, we can't think about tours as guided only, right? We have to think, again, going back to kind of what we're saying with customization, we can create a quote unquote tour experience. It's very much self-guided, almost museum-like, if you will, in a lot of distilleries. If you have spaces in particular within your tasting room, and most bars and tasting rooms, restaurants, even hotel lobbies have this, right? They have areas or hubs of activity, and there's always those places that just don't draw people for one reason or another. It's out of the way, it's odd shape, whatever it might be. Really think about using those spaces to create kind of a quote unquote tour experience, if a guided tour is not something that you do already. And even if you do, it's something that's important to utilize. Again, another point of customization. Maybe I don't want to do the big tour, but I'd love to spend a few minutes looking around at signage or different things that you might produce to educate people about what you're doing. The second part is, and I was talking to this prior to getting started here, was as you, and many of you might kind of feel this already, and maybe the reason that you've joined the webinar today, the production part of business starts to look very dissimilar from the visitation or the tasting room start of business, the more robust kind of either or both get. And what I mean by that is the things that you have to value and pay attention to on the distillery floor are different from the demands and different bits of variability on the tasting room side of things, right? The people that you need, the types of people that you need. And so just be sensitive that processes that worked for production won't necessarily fit as nicely on the front of the house side of things, as we like to say. The other part of it, and I'm going to flip sides real quick, but before we move on, is this idea of really trying to take your brand when we think about tasting rooms and tell a story that is universally applicable, right? So I mentioned before the idea of spirit enthusiasts to first timers as kind of being this spectrum. If we can create stories for our staff within our tasting narratives for when we're doing tastings in whatever form we do those, on the tours, obviously, if we can create a story and manage that story somewhere in the middle, it allows our staff, our hospitality staff, to then kind of cater that story in the ways that are fitting to whatever party is in front of them at the time. I think what I've found over the years is that distilleries do a great job for spirits nerds like me, and I'm sure you, on doing a really detailed about very specific choices and those sort of things. And then others that do a great job of just being kind of hands off and letting you do what you want to. If we can work really hard to find that middle ground, it allows for that kind of control at the lowest level amongst your staff to move that story in whichever way you want to. All right. So interpretation, what I'm kind of speaking over is this idea that, not interpretation in terms of like language, I always have to clarify that, but interpretation in terms of we probably all at minimum have in our head some of the messages that we want to convey to people when they come to our tasting room, right? And that, of course, probably starts with specifics about the spirits that we're producing, flavor profiles, and those kind of more product and production oriented things. And then on the other end would be things specifically about our brand story or our founding or why we exist or values that might go beyond our operations. All of this is fair game for this idea of interpretation. And interpretation is simply the idea of there are things that we want to convey. What are some ways or strategies or methods in which we can do that to an audience that is really not predetermined, right? Anybody that comes through the door should get that same general message, right? And that's all a game of interpretation. So again, everybody is going to have a little bit of a different dynamic at their own distillery on opportunities for interpretation, right? Fundamentally, if we're talking tasting rooms, the value is in the interpretation that occurs during a tasting, right? There's a couple of ways to look at it. We can sell flights, provide some text-based information about the different samples a person might have, and be available as a bartender or as staff to answer any questions they might have, right? I call that the kind of the craft beer model of beer tasting, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have what I call like the Napa Valley model, which is we have a certain subset that we're going to taste through, and I'm going to give you pretty in-depth information about each one of the 4 or 5 samples that we might be tasting through. And then there might be some wiggle room in there depending on your proclivities to go down a certain road, right? And so if we think about that at opposite ends of the spectrum, really it's about finding where that fits most within the dynamic of what else you're doing, right? And how much staff you have available and how much space and the demand in terms of what you've seen in terms of people coming through your door, right? And I've seen all be very successful. That's really where we have to start if we're talking about tasting rooms specifically, right? However, if we're talking about interpretation and needing to hook in that first timer in equal measure to the spirit enthusiast, a lot of times it's everything else that goes on around that that's going to tip those scales, right? And so I've listed off a few here. Displays, I've kind of already mentioned. Obviously, how you kind of design and create a space for your gift shop or your retail, what your tasting bar looks like, right? Is it a one-on-one experience, or is it we're going to wait for the bar to fill up before we do a tasting? And what does that look like, and how does it fit within your space? Obviously, then we get into all, of course, of the variability of what certain people can do and what others can't, right? Do you have the ability to do a cocktail bar, and is that something that you're interested in? And I would just say this for the purposes of this webinar. If you're not there yet, that is, of course, a point of leverage, both for your brand and your profit, but it also does open up an entirely even different set of business challenges, but opportunities as well. But what I would say that when we think about tasting rooms relative to cocktail bars, it's a really interesting dynamic. The reality is that most of the spirits that are being sold are being consumed in cocktails. I think that's a pretty obvious thing. And so that balance has to be dealt with delicately. And what I would say is that I have rarely seen places be able to do both in equal measure. So just it's an important kind of question to have amongst your team if that's a decision point. And I'll just leave it at that, because when we talk about cocktail bars, again, it gets to be a whole different ball of wax. And then the last thing in there that I would say, regardless of your setup, is think about the things that you can do or the parts of your distillery that make you unique that you don't necessarily think about, right? So I'll just give you a really mundane example. I've been to distilleries that will remain nameless where they have a beautiful, open window view of the distillery floor. It's really long and linear, and you can kind of see their process. And then they have a cocktail bar, and the cocktail bar faces the opposite way from all this beautiful windows for no structural or engineering reason that we could figure out. It's those simple things like you see that view every day, and your bartenders see that view every day, but the value would be spinning it around and allowing that to be ultimately a part of the experience. So things as simple as that, where you're located and how you can coordinate with the people around you, especially when it comes to things like food service. If you're into doing cocktails, you don't have to do that yourself. There's a lot of options these days with coordinating through delivery and those sort of things. Classes, I'm a teacher, so I'll be biased towards this. But when we want to further pull people down that affinity chain in terms of our brand, offering classes, more in-depth information, there is trend lines and research all over the place amongst sociologists and people that study motivations behind experience that say that education piece, that desire to be a quote unquote expert in something is only growing. And so I would recommend strongly that people capitalize on that if you're kind of at that point in your operations. And then events. And events is something that we'll talk about specifically here in a second. But those can be really good opportunities for interpretation. Bring people into the fold that wouldn't necessarily go out of their way to visit the distillery on any other given day, right? Some rules of thumb, customization. We've kind of already talked a little bit about that. And if anybody has any more questions, that's one that I'd be interested to discuss. The idea of immersion, right? Many of us have been to modern theme parks. This is what they survive on. And I'm 40 now. People that are younger than me, immersive experiences, whether it be through a video game screen or all of the different messages that we're receiving on a daily basis, is kind of the standard, right? And so we have to kind of get away from the old museum model. Here's the information, here's the display, you consume it. I was just talking this morning with a group about how there was some research that just came out that said the average adult attention span is 7 seconds. So if you have anything that takes longer than 7 seconds at any given point to consume, you risk not even being able to keep their attention, right? So immersion. And again, I refer back to my idea around the 5 senses, what are ways where we can bring all those in. Again, we don't want to bombard people, but we want to give that kind of feel to the experience. And we want to do that through a variety of mediums, right? Talked about signage, infographic type displays can be really, really helpful to the experience. Not everyone's as comfortable as I am with chewing the fat with an anonymous bartender, but if you have that information in a different form, that can enhance their experience. Again, a nod to that idea of customization. So thinking about that, there's also some value. There can be some value in that, right? We don't have to do it a certain way. We can be more efficient and even save some money if we do it in other ways. All right. Retail. We're at the half-hour mark, so I'm going to kind of breeze through this. I don't want to take too much time. I think about it in kind of 3 distinct ways: process, product, and display. And the reason I like to think about that is because I think each one means something different. And again, it allows you to think through what space do we have available, and what currently exists in terms of retail, where might we want to move it, right? And then within these 3 parameters, it becomes relatively straightforward in doing that. So the first is process. A couple of things, and then if anybody has questions, please feel free to ask. Post-sale packaging, okay? People like nice bags and good boxes. And I know that when we're thinking about that, that's yet another line item cost that we want to reduce. But we are in, most of us, the premium product business, right? And so incorporating that even into, for instance, a bottle cost is not going to necessarily be enough of a marginal difference in our own retail space. And the value from that, from a marketing perspective, is quite large. I also like to mention here also the magic of the 2-bottle box, right? So we've all seen the single cardboard box, but we've also seen the double cardboard box that'll fit 2 750s. People love to fill up the 2-bottle box, right? And so that's just a little thing that I always think about when I think about post-sale packaging. Listen to the customer and to guide purchasing. Don't think nowadays that you have to order in quantity. If we're talking t-shirts or stickers, if something sells well, keep ordering it. If something doesn't sell well, don't fear never ordering it again and getting rid of it at cost. Turn and burn, as I like to say, is a key value here. Double the cost is definitely still the keystone metric when we're trying to establish retail price, right? And that would be where we would want to start at a baseline, and we can build up to there based on market, right? So willingness to pay. I still like to pay $20 for a t-shirt, but in some markets, $30 is totally feasible. So understand what others are doing around you can be really important. Don't buy deep. I just kind of mentioned that. Dedication to suppliers is really not necessary, right? And it's not to say that you don't want to establish good relationships with the people that you do business with. However, when it comes to retail products, there's a lot of fish in that pond, and all are relatively equal. Order fulfillment and shipping turnaround are the two, to me, most critical factors. So if somebody's not doing well in those two, move on to the next. And then scale prices and goods, right? So don't just have the $25 t-shirts. Maybe have a $15 t-shirt and then a really nice long sleeve at $35, right? And then, of course, that stands for products across the board, okay? The second one, product, when it comes to bottles, and of course, this is now getting complicated with direct-to-consumer, what we're allowed, et cetera, different ways for the consumer to buy the actual base product that you're selling, right? So if it's feasible to put it in the little bottles or put it in a 3-pack or not just do the standard 750s, from a tasting room retail perspective, that can be really valuable, okay? It's a commitment thing, right? So I kind of like that new rum that you guys came out with, but do I want to commit to a 750? No, but if I buy the half one, then I'll go home, make some killer cocktails, and then I'm going to come back and get that bottle. So again, customization. And again, I know this becomes difficult and there's a lot of legality around that. But if it's feasible, it's something to consider. I think of retail beyond your bottle sales as what I call the t-shirt and sticker standard. If you're not selling t-shirts and stickers, you're definitely missing out on an opportunity there. With that said, location matters, right? I'm in Florida. You better have some tank tops because for about 6 months of the year, that's the only thing that I'm going to consider. Other places, it might be flipped the other way. And I do like to see hoodies, right? When it gets cold. So don't fear changing out your merchandise, right? And again, I know I'm complicating how you do business, but that's just the reality of it. Be seasonal. Co-branding is great. Co-branding in terms of trend lines in the retail space continues to grow, right? This can be great for craft distilleries as more local businesses. Co-brand with local companies that fit your culture and might mesh well with you, and you can build merchandise off of that. Of the month merchandise or specials, this is how you can tap in not just from out of towners, but local people as well. Craft beer does a really good job of this typically. Consumables. Think about consumables beyond just the spirits that you sell, right? Does somebody locally make a salsa with your whiskey or anything of that nature? Those things people love, and it will just increase your average sale. Limited edition merchandise. And the last bit of advice, and this is something that I've thought about more recently, is don't fall totally in love with your logo, right? So yes, we want to get the brand out there. Logo, if that's a big part of your brand messaging, is important, but it doesn't necessarily need to be universally on everything, right? We can play with it a little bit. People definitely like to see that. And then lastly, and the shortest one, display. Height matters, right? Put hats high, put toys low, right? That's kind of the old adage, right? I have a 10 and a 7-year-old. Anything at my waist below is where their attention is. If I'm looking for a hat, I'm looking up. It's kind of one of those yeah, duh things, but it's important to think about. People tend to naturally turn right when they enter a retail space. This might look weird because I'm mirrored, but so think about how people flow throughout your retail space. It can be really important, right? People typically tend to turn right. People love a clearance and sales rack, right? You don't even have to put it on that much sale. They just love to see it. Interactive displays are good, and lingering is good. So within your retail space, can you create interpretation that might keep them there for a few minutes, right? It lets husband or wife wander around and find something else that they might want to buy, type of idea. So those are just kind of lessons learned that are relatively universal in their application. But again, this would differ dependent on the space, your particular retail space. All right, on-site events, considerations for on-site events, I think of as twofold. development, and operations. Development wise, what will it take and can it be done? That's the primary question. And then secondary to that, if it can be done, are we going to be able to do all of it? Or are we going to have to get people from outside? Because that's a very different calculation, right? Think about it from a strategic communication perspective when it comes to events. Many times there are not necessarily more moving parts in an event than in your daily operations. The difference is you have mastered all the moving parts in your daily operations, and events tend to throw all that stuff into flux. So kind of take that same approach that you did early on when you were establishing your processes at the distillery. Coordination between resources that are available or that you're willing to have on hand need to be matched with your marketing goals, right? While it's great to throw an event for all of your loyal customers, right? Anniversary parties are great for this, right? A way you kind of reward and support and mutually celebrate. Where the money is in an event is getting people there that might never have been to your distillery, right? Those fringe folks that are interested but need a reason. So think about that in terms of what you're doing and who you want to be there. And again, doesn't mean that we don't want to celebrate our loyal customers vis-a-vis an event, but in terms of the economic value of that, it's something to consider. And then operations wise, strong leadership and effective delegation. I can't stress enough how much it's very much a teamwork type of a thing. And many of you all know this because you've been involved with events. I call it the warm body problem. Always need more people than you think you need, right? So if you think you need 10 people, have 15 on hand. Those extra 5 volunteers will do you wonders. Make sure that you're on top of your facilities or equipment. Again, this gets more complicated if we're having to have outside vendors in. Save more space and time for setup and tear down than you think you might need. Of course, anytime operationally, I would be remiss not to mention the additional safety and security risk, and be conscious of any potential extra layer of permitting. You might not be serving or doing anything differently the day of the event, but for reasons of capacity numbers or parking or the need for a garbage plan or adequate bathrooms or all these different things that municipalities and counties pay attention to, just understand there might be an extra layer of permitting. The last thing I will say is, and this is a bit of a different conversation, but don't lose sight of your distillery as simply a location for other events, right? To us, they're work, and to us, they're not. It's the aesthetic that we're used to every day. They're still relatively unique amongst the populace, right? So if you can, a bit of side business is really easy to build up in terms of rehearsal dinners, celebrations of various things like anniversaries and this, even if you don't do any of that stuff typically, because unless we operate 24/7, there's always going to be time where we can better utilize our spaces, and doing those small scale events is an opportunity that I think many of you could use to your advantage. I'm going to skip over these because we're running out of time. I did want to mention a couple of things. Customer management systems, or CMS. Some of you, many of you, may use CMS of different types. It may be an add-on to your distillery management software. I'm not here to sell it. And I'm, to be honest, not really in-depth familiar with any of the platforms. But what I am interested in is how they can be used to leverage all of the investment we put in our tasting rooms and in people visiting our distillery, right? Beyond our commercial accounts and any kind of distribution that we might be doing, that we might be using some of this CMS for. I don't have to read over those bullets. You see them there, 1 through 5. I think that the core goals here are, if it's possible, and if it doesn't detract from the feel of your place or the experience that you want people to have, collecting the detailed customer information, particularly as it pertains to tracking their purchase behavior, right, can be really nice. If you do reservations of any type for tours or classes or anything, This can be really easily linked in now to different CMS platforms. That can be really valuable because it does go a lot towards building loyalty. If you start to establish yourself and you seem to have a repetitive customer base that you want to start incentivizing for continual purchasing, these can be really effective in building those loyalty programs, pretty much free of most effort on your behalf, aside from setting it up. And then it, of course, with AI and the like, and I know that that's a scary word for folks, but there's a lot of easy analysis that can be done behind the scenes in terms of that customer data and in terms of like helping you make marketing decisions. These are the kind of customers that, you know, are the most lucrative for you, but these are the markets that you're missing and that sort of thing. And a lot of that stuff can be mined from existing customer information that comes from CMS. Real quickly, VIP experiences, and this kind of goes to that idea of building towards brand affinity and creating brand ambassadors. VIP experiences, and all I mean by this is I'm bad at marketing myself, but these experiences that go quote unquote above and beyond the typical experience, right? And there's a lot of examples of this in the hospitality space, many of which you all might be familiar with. It's complimentary and it's anticipatory, right? And Ritz for me still does the best in making note of this. It's what so in the hotels, they have 5 diamonds. So they call it the 6th diamond. It's what kind of separates them from all of the other luxury out there. Mystique, emotional engagement, and functional. This has to do with anticipating needs. And you can read their experience enlivens the senses, instills well-being, and fulfills. It's very like high-minded, but that's what we're trying to create within kind of the feel of these VIP customers, right? And so there's 2 things: employee empowerment. So you have to let people treat customers like VIPs and give them kind of the freedom to do so, even though that can be kind of scary. And then the other part of it is I was just brainstorming over the last few days about different ones that I've interacted with over the years of visiting different distilleries, just to give you guys some potential ideas of things that you might want to think about, right? And of course, we could talk at length about any of those. We are past the 45-minute mark. I have a problem with talking too much, so we'll call it there. I was told to sell myself, so if you want to get in touch, that is my day job email. I am working on finishing a book up for ADI that talks about distillery visitation in general. So anything from what we talked about today to cocktail bars to on and off-site events and on down the line. I will be in Baltimore in August, I believe. So if you don't catch up with me before then, you can definitely find me there. I do want to make myself available for in person or online or formal or informal consult. I love this stuff, and I have the luxury of being a professor in my day job, and so this stuff is all gravy to me. So I would love to hear about the stuff that you guys are doing in any way that I might be able to help out. But I will open it up to the group for any questions, and I think we're going to use the Q&A to do that. And I'm seeing one. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that I can make the PowerPoint fully available, and I believe there's a recording of this presentation webinar that you will be able to access as well. Sorry, the question was, will you be able to get access to the slideshow? If you want the PowerPoint file, just shoot me an email and I'll send it back to you. Otherwise, the webinar will be available. All right. Seeing no more questions, I think we'll just call it. Again, any thoughts around CRM software? Yes. None that I mean, product-wise, no. I have some thoughts around what you should look for in whichever platforms you're after. But that's a lot longer of a conversation in my mind. That probably is not helpful at all. But if you want to shoot me an email, I'd love to chat on that more. Yes. So this is an interesting one. So the question is, what are your thoughts in regard to charging customers for tasting flights? I think my first thought is, if the market bears it, 100%. And if you're operating at a certain scale, it really only makes sense to charge for it, right? I don't think we're in a situation where you can't charge for it. That used to be the case in some states. My second thought on it is, if you're going to charge for flights, I like to see being really directive on the flights that you offer. Now, it may be that you don't have enough in the portfolio of spirits that you make to offer different types of flights. If you do, that's the route I would go. If you don't, give them a choice, right? I think a lot of times we think of a flight as, 3 or 4 at minimum, but a flight of 2 is okay, right? And again, that idea of customization, right? So maybe you scale it up in that way. But again, fundamentally, if the market bears it, absolutely you should be charging for it, even if it's a cost charge, right? Even if you're just covering yourself and and the person that's doing the pouring. But if you're operating at a certain scale, there is a tipping point where offering free samples or flights, if you will, even if it's only a select number of the spirits that you offer, it has been shown to drastically increase bottle sales. So unless I knew your specific situation, I'd leave it at that. Yeah. So if you're a smaller distillery, I'd be hard pressed to recommend giving stuff out for free, right? Now, you might want to make it, again, if you can work it to being a cost proposition, then that gives a lot of value to the customer. But again, that would be individual to your situation. It's a great question. And then, by the way, in my experience, you see it kind of, I would say overall, more would charge than not charge, for sure. For sure. But there is still some variability there. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I'll go ahead and call it. Oh, excuse me. Another one just came in. What would be a reasonable charge for a flight of 5 half-ounce pours? Reasonable is it's pretty wide open. If you assume it this way, right? So 1.5 ounces as a shot in a bar would be anywhere from $5 or $6 to, I mean, the sky's the limit, right? But on average, say $12 for a call at a bar. And so if you work backwards from that, right, a 1/2 ounce on the low end is at least a couple of dollars. On the high end, 4 or 5, right? I wouldn't necessarily push it, because we all know that we're making the juice in the back. So there's some savings there. But that maybe would be a good starting point. But again, I'm just putting it out there as the way that I might calculate back. You are obviously providing the service above and beyond that, depending on how involved the tasting is, right? Do you have somebody there guiding them through the tasting? In that case, I'd feel okay about charging, $10, $15, even $20 for a flight of 5. But if it's just me handing them to you, I'd maybe be on the lower end of that, right? Hopefully that kind of answers your question. And again, what the market would bear. Look around to those around you and see. And if you think they're cheap, charge a little bit more. And if you think they're too expensive, charge a little bit less. And then, of course, there's other calculations of how that fits with your brand, et cetera. Thanks, you guys, for taking the time. Hopefully you've gotten something out of it. Please do say hi if you're going to be in Baltimore and you see me. I kind of wander around aimlessly. Um, again, I appreciate it. If you have any follow-up, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email is the easiest way. Otherwise, Happy New Year to everyone, and have a good day. Oh, yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. Absolutely. Yeah, shoot me an email if you can't find me. Cheers.